Hey everybody, and welcome back to Final Fantasy, the final episode of Final Fantasy. We're just gonna be wrapping it up this time. And to wrap it up, I had an idea for a topic that I wanted to discuss. This is one of the ideas I had when I first started this series, and wasn't entirely sure. Well, it wasn't so much that I wasn't sure if I would get around to it, because when this series first started, I didn't even know if I was going to have enough material to make it to the end of the game. But largely because of how I kind of rambled during the top 10 segment, we managed to reach the end. And on the topic of rambling, I want to try to focus and get on this topic to hopefully see it through to the end. If I don't finish discussing my thoughts by the time the game is over, then I'll just real quick, rapid fire, finish it up. But the idea I had was to do a tier list of all of the spells in this game. Now, just a heads up, this is purely a subjective, opinionated list. This is just my opinions of the spells and how I feel about them based on how I play the game. So, a lot of people will probably have different thoughts about certain spells, but I'm still going to try to also discuss just what I genuinely think the usefulness of certain spells are. But again, it's more these tiers or rankings are catered more towards how I play the game, or the kind of use I get out of spells based on how I play. We're gonna start with white magic, because white magic comes first in the instruction manual. I have a printout of all the spells from a PDF of the instruction manual just sitting next to me. And we're going to be doing rankings from A, B, C, D, and E, with A obviously being the highest and E being the lowest. A is just the exceptional rank. These are the spells that I pretty much never go without, unless I just don't have a job that can use them. B spells are powerful spells, but I might sometimes not use, just for the sake of mixing things up a bit. C spells are spells that I think are just very middle of the road. There's nothing really exceptional about them, but there's nothing really great about them. Those are the spells where I really feel like you can just take it or leave it. And then D is the opposite end of the spectrum from B, whereas they're spells that I don't necessarily think are particularly good or useful, but I will sometimes use them just to mix things up. Not so much because I think they're the ideal choice for spells, but just to do things a little bit differently, especially if I'm doing another run of the game very shortly after a previous run, and I don't want it to feel like the exact same game. These are the kinds of spells that I'm likely to use on a run like that. But conventionally, they're spells that either get left behind or I just don't use very often if I do pick them. And then E is just the spells that I think are total garbage. I will still sometimes use E rank spells, but I just don't think they're very good. I'm also going to be judging them not just based on the spells themselves, but also their levels, because I feel like that is an extremely important element when it comes to the usefulness of spells compared to others, is the competition when it comes to their levels and having to choose certain spells over other spells, and also just your magic points, which just the fact that each of these spells is competing not only for a slot in your spellbook, but also a slot, or not a slot, but also competing for your magic points, because each time you cast a spell, you're also expending magic points for those certain spells, so is it worthwhile to do that, you could say. So I'm dividing them by levels in particular, so certain spells that might be a really high or a really low rank might not be that way they're not being judged that way in regards to all of the spells in the game, but more so the spells that they're being weighed against, because they share the same level, so the comparison is at its most relevant, both in regards to what spells you choose for that level in your spellbook, and how you're using your magic points while playing through the game. So, starting off at White Magic level 1, the first spell is the Cure spell. And that, I just gotta give the Cure spell a nice solid A. That is a spell that is useful from the very start of the game all the way through to the end. Just being able to heal yourself and get that little bit of extra energy. Especially because I feel like I've talked about this already in this game, but so much of the difficulty of this game is attrition. A battle of attrition, trying to get through to the end of a dungeon and survive without running out of resources. And sometimes all you need to get to the end of a dungeon is just a few extra heal spells. And so the Cure spell, while eventually it falls off and isn't very useful during battle, it can still give you that extra push, that extra little bit of energy you need to make the difference between making it to the end of the dungeon or getting a game over because you run out of hit points. Especially once you get to the point where you're no longer likely going to be using your level 1 magic points with your White Mage for anything other than the Cure spell. Next up we have Harm, and that is an interesting one because it's extremely useful in that there's so many undead enemies in this game, and the fact that it's a level 1 spell, so it's not competing for much stronger spells. And honestly, being able to just zap a bunch of enemies is probably more useful than healing, because you'll probably prevent more damage by just taking all of the enemies out than you would. That you'll prevent more damage by just taking the enemies out than what you would get back by casting a Cure spell. I still don't think I'd put Harm at A though, just because it's so situational and eventually the damage falls off. And the damage of an attack spell falling off, I feel, is a greater detriment than the effectiveness of a heal spell falling off, because even when the heal spell's power falls off, that's only in battle. It can still be useful outside of battle. I think I would give Harm a B. I think I would put Harm at B because it is still a really useful spell, especially early on. And even after you start getting other group spells, it can be the difference between your Fire 2 spell or your basic attacks with your fighters. It could be the difference between those attacks either defeating or weakening a large group of undead enemies, especially when you start getting to ones that have a lot more hit points. Next we have Fog. And Fog I think I would rate as C. Same with Ruse. Both of them are powerful spells, but the problem is they can wind up doing nothing. If you cast Fog on a character or Ruse on yourself, and that character then proceeds to not be attacked during the course of the battle, or at least not attacked in a way where those effects matter, then you wasted a magic point. You cast Fog on your Black Belt and then he doesn't get hit, or you cast a Ruse to protect your White Mage because your White Mage is low on hit points, and then your White Mage doesn't get targeted with any attacks. You just wasted a magic point. And because of that alone, I think I have to put both of those spells at C rank, because they're still really good spells. It's just the fact that that possibility exists, that they can wind up doing nothing, or they can wind up firing off too late. You can try casting Fog on your Thief, and then your Thief gets the crap beat out of them, and then your Fog spell fires off. So it's just, I feel like I can't. If it was just based on the effects alone, I'd probably put both of those at B as well, just because they do have really good effects for increasing your survivability. But just the fact that they can wind up ultimately doing nothing if the character you cast them on doesn't end up being attacked after you've cast it, I gotta put both of those at C. Still, all of the White Mage's level 1 spells are good. That's one of the levels that I think it's a bit tougher to like pick and choose something or another, as opposed to level 2. Level 2 White Magic, we start with the spell Lamp. Lamp, I pretty much never use Lamp because I feel like all 3 of the other spells are more useful, but I don't think Lamp necessarily sucks. It can be useful in the situations where you need it, but Blind in this game overall is not that devastating. It can really suck early on, but once you start getting more hits, it will still reduce your overall damage, but it's just not... Blind isn't as devastating in this game as it might be in some other games, although I feel like in general the blind status effect in most RPGs is usually one of the weaker ones. So for that, I would have to give Lamp a D. It can be useful, but it's very situational when it is useful, and even then, Blind just isn't that devastating, especially when we compare it again to the competition, which is the other level 2 white spells, starting with Mute. Mute is an interesting one, because it can prevent enemies from using spells, and I believe breath attacks and other special attacks like Cremate and Blizzard also count as magic, I believe. So, and the fact that magic is so devastating in this game, but Mute can also fail? I think I would put Mute at a C, because it is extremely useful when it does work, but just the fact that it can fail means I think I would put it at C. I don't know, I'm kind of juggling Mute between B and C, because it is really powerful when it does work, and it can be a lifesaver, especially if you get it off right at the start of the turn. But then it also suffers from the problem of Fog and Ruse, where it can wind up not doing anything if it fires off too late, or if it just misses, or if you mute an enemy and then that enemy decides to not even use magic. So I think I'd put Mute at C. If I could, or maybe C+, if I was doing pluses and minuses instead of just flat letters, I think I would put Mute at either C+ or B-. But because of its situational nature, I think I have to take the lower, go on the lower step of that and give it C. Same with Anti-Lightning. Anti-Lightning is an extremely powerful spell because it drastically reduces the damage from lightning magic. But that only matters if you're fighting enemies that use lightning magic, and that's what makes it a weird spell. I think I have to also give Anti-Lightning a C, just because it is so extremely situational. But in the situations where it is useful, it's an A tier spell, because it will absolutely save your life. But because it's only useful in those very specific circumstances, I would have to give it a C. In fact, no, I'm gonna bump Mute up to B, because I'm looking at the spells of level 2, and just the fact that in comparison to the other level 2 spells, Mute feels the most universally useful and life-saving, so I think I would bump Mute up to B. I still wouldn't give it an A rank, because of the fact that it can miss or fail, or ultimately wind up not helping in any way if it doesn't go off in time or anything like that. It still has a lot of conditions, so I can't put it at A, but I would put Mute up to B because of the competition at level 2. Because especially once I get further in the game, that's oftentimes the only level 2 spell I'm using. Unless I'm against an enemy I know uses lightning. Lastly, we have Invisibility, which I gotta put at C for the exact same reasons as Fog and Ruse. Just the fact that because it's effectively the same type of spell, just a defensive protection spell on a single character, but then that character can wind up not getting attacked. Or the spell can go off after they were hit instead of before. So, still a really powerful effect. I've absolutely been saved before by spells like Invisibility and Fog, but just the fact that they can wind up wasting a magic point without doing anything. In so many ways. Yeah, I just gotta put them at C, just very middle of the road. Moving on to level 3 White Magic, starting with Cure 2. Just like with Cure, I gotta put that at A, for the exact same reasons as Cure. It doesn't get quite as many magic points, but it still has that same usefulness. And then there's also Harm 2. Harm 2 I would have to put at B, because it's just a powerful AoE spell that blasts the hell out of undead enemies. It only works on undead enemies, which makes it very situational. If there were fewer undead enemies in this game, I would probably put Harm 2 at C. Just because it would still be a powerful spell, but it would just be so situational as far as when it's useful. But there are so many undead enemies in this game, and so many of them are extremely dangerous because there's so many of them that can paralyze you or just do all this other crap that I feel like having a spell that can decimate undead enemies is just extremely useful, far more useful than it would be in most other RPGs. And then Anti-Fire is C rank for exactly the same reason as Anti-Lightning. Extremely powerful, definitely an A rank spell when it's useful, but it's useful for such a small percentage of the game that I just can't see myself justifying giving it a higher ranking. And then there's the Heal spell. The Heal spell sucks. When I was a kid, I always got Cure 2, Anti-Fire, and Heal. But as an adult, I realize the Heal spell just doesn't heal enough. Yes, it heals your entire party, but the amount that it heals is so minuscule that you really have to ask yourself, is it even worth bothering to cast at all? Especially over just having Cure 2 available, or holding on to, say, a Harm 2 spell for blowing away a group of undead. So I feel like I would have to give the Heal spell a D. Not completely useless, it still can be useful, just because, I mean, you're still healing your entire party. It's just, it doesn't heal enough to really feel worthwhile, especially because that's the kind of spell you're likely going to be wanting to use to mitigate group damage, but I think every single group attack in the entire game that enemies can use deals more damage than the Heal spell can restore. Or will also be elemental. Yeah, I think the only spell that might be weak enough for the Heal spell to really matter in regards to mitigating the group damage from the enemies is the spell Scorch? It's Scorch or Cremate. I'm pretty sure Scorch is the weaker one. But that's a fire elemental spell, which you can also just reduce by casting Anti-Fire instead. So the Heal spell just isn't that useful. It's extremely useful when used with the Heal Rod, but that's only because you can use the Heal Rod infinitely. But with the Heal spell being limited to magic points, I just don't think it's worth that MP cost in very many situations. Now we move on to level 4 White Magic. Level 4 White Magic is infamously trash. We start with the Pure spell. Here's the thing about the Pure spell. Inherently, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, inherently it's a really powerful spell because getting poisoned in this game sucks ass. Not only for the damage you take walking around and in battle, although the battle damage becomes trivial rather quickly, but also the sound effect when walking. That may be the worst part. That may even be worse than getting a game over, is having to listen to that sound effect. And the Pure spell lets you heal poison. The problem is that the Pure spell is economically completely useless because you can buy, I think, like 80 something Pure potions for the exact same cost as the Pure spell, and you're probably never going to need that many Pure potions throughout the entire game. So you can just not buy the Pure spell and instead spend that money on 80 Pure potions and be set just as well while leaving the rest of your spellbook slots for level 3 open for the other 3 spells. But here's the thing. The other level 4 spells for White Mage are so terrible that I feel like I still have to give the Pure spell either a B or a C rank. Because despite the fact that it's literally a waste of money, it's still more useful than the other spells available. At least 2 of them. So I think I would give Pure a C. Because it can be handy, especially if you like forget to buy Pure potions, you have that spell as backup, or if you're playing the original game and you can't adjust and you can't buy multiple items simultaneously, you might want to have the Pure spell just to save time, so you don't have to sit there clicking 160 times or however many times it would take to buy that many Pure potions. You can just have the Pure spell and be golden. So there's that benefit as well. Now, next up is the Fear spell. The Fear spell can make enemies run away. Why would I want to make enemies run away and not get the experience and money for them? Especially because this game can be a bit grindy, even without using that spell. Now, I understand that it can be useful because you're making the fight easier on yourself. It's because for every enemy that it works on and then makes run away, you effectively instantly killed that enemy. You didn't get any money or experience for it, but you are getting the benefit of surviving. Especially if you're in a really tough dungeon, or if you're just trying to make your way back to a dungeon and you don't really have many resources left. And also, again, the competition for level 4 White Magic is so terrible that also gives Fear a little bit of merit, because what the fuck else are you going to spend your level 4 White Magic points on? And for that reason alone, I think I can still only give Fear a D. Just because, unless you're in an extremely desperate situation, I would rather have the experience points than make a battle easier. Unless making that battle easier is the difference between life or death. But even then, if I'm in that tough of a situation, I would rather just run away. I would rather just try running away and hope for the best than cast the Fear spell to get rid of half of the battle and then still have to survive the other half. Next is Anti-Ice, and despite the pattern with the anti-spells, I have to give Anti-Ice an A ranking. Anti-Ice I have to give an A ranking, strictly for the fact that it's the only level 4 white spell that's actually worth buying. And 95% of the time, that's the even for the fact of how situational Anti-Ice is. 95% of the time, that's the only level 4 white spell I'm going to be using. So for that reason alone, it has to be given an A rank. Just because of that contrast. Because lastly, is Anti-Mute, which gets a 100% an E. Absolutely useless spell. Not only are there, I believe, only 2 enemies in the entire game that can cast a Mute, but odds are, even if you encounter those enemies, they're probably not going to use the spell anyway. And even if they do use the spell, you're probably better off just killing them than worrying about healing Silence, because Silence is gonna wear off after the battle ends anyway. The only status effects in this game that persist after battle are Poison and Petrification. Also, is the fact that the Mute spell, which is the only thing in this game that inflicts Silence, it hits the entire party. So not only would you have to be in a situation where you get muted, and that same situation where it's worth casting Anti-Mute to unsilence your mages in order to win the battle, but you also have to hope that Mute doesn't hit your white mage, because if your white mage was one of the characters who got silenced, they're not going to be able to cast Anti-Mute to heal Silence anyway. So it's such an extremely situational spell. It's never going to be useful. I think in the tons of times I've probably played through this game about a dozen or more times. I wouldn't pluralize that dozen. I don't think I've beaten it that many times, but I've definitely beaten this game many times. Even a few times on the PlayStation. Most of my runs have been on the NES, but even a few runs on the PlayStation. And I think only once in my entire life have I ever seen an enemy cast Mute. In all of those runs. So, and even then, I don't even know if I had Anti-Mute, but even if I did, it just wasn't worth, I wasn't in a situation where it was worth bothering to use. I was better off just finishing the fight, because the fight was almost over anyway by time the enemy did cast Mute. So I just finished the battle and moved along. So Anti-Mute is completely useless. The most useless spell in the entire game, if you ask me. Not just level 4 white mage, just period. In fact, no, I'm not gonna rate Anti-Mute E. I'm gonna go all the way through the fucking alphabet and rate Anti-Mute a Z, because that's what it deserves. Next up is level 5 white magic, and we're starting off with Cure 3. Now this is a bit of a tougher one. Especially because at this point, you're not going to be having quite as many magic points. So, it's going to be a lot harder to just spam this spell outside of battle. It heals a lot more, and it actually is useful even at the end of the game during battle. So it's hard to say, especially looking at the other level 5 white spells. I think I'm gonna rate Cure 3 an A. Which sounds weird because I gave both Cure and I think Cure 2 an A ranking. Oh no, wait, not A. I got mixed up. For a second, I was thinking that I had an S rank on this tier until I looked back at Cure and Cure 2. No, Cure 3 I'm gonna give a B. Which is weird because Cure and Cure 2 I gave an A ranking, and both of those are more powerful. But I feel like they're a little bit more overall useful, or maybe not necessarily even more useful, but they have less stiff competition because all of White's level 5 spells are really useful. And so I think I would give that a B. Because it's really strong in battle, really strong outside of battle, but they're stiffer competition, you have less level 5 magic points. You don't have those spells for as long, so they're not carrying you through as much of the game. The Cure and Cure 2 spells carry you through a lot of the most difficult parts of the game. Whereas, by the time you have a lot of level 5 spells, you're at, like, the second half of the game. and so it's not as hard of a game at that point, so you don't even need as much healing or as powerful of healing unless you're in battle. But also, has to do with the other white spells as well, because I feel like level 5 is the first level with white magic where I feel like I can go with any of the spells just as well. I don't feel like any one spell really dominates the competition over the others. That said, I would have to give the life spell a maximum A ranking because there's no revival items in this game. And you're not getting life 2 until level 8, which you might not even reach depending on your levels. Or if you do, you won't have many magic points with it. So I have to give life an A, just because it may be the only way you can revive your characters. And even if it's not the only way to revive your characters, it's likely going to be for the vast majority of the game. And having a character die in the middle of a dungeon can be extremely rough. So just finally being able to revive characters, especially since there's no revival items, at least not until later versions of the game. So I would have to rate life an A, just because it provides that advantage, and it's an advantage that nothing else can give you. Next up is Harm 3. Harm 3, I think I would rate a C. Maybe a B, but probably a C. Because I feel like at that point it starts to become a little bit excessive. Still useful, but a little bit excessive. I feel like for most undead enemies, Harm 2 is good enough to either wipe them out or at least weaken them enough to get them within kill range for a Fire 2 spell or your fighters to finish them off. So, at least from my experiences. So Harm 3 is still really good. Oftentimes, I'll sometimes grab Harm 3. And it is useful when I do get it, but I feel like it's kind of at that threshold of being sort of redundant, because Harm 2 is usually good enough, especially when complemented by other things, other spells, or just other items, especially once you start getting a lot of the attack items during the second half of the game, when you're likely going to be having a lot more level 5 magic points to really be taking advantage of that spell. Not only that, but I honestly would rather, in a lot of situations, not all situations, but a number of situations, I feel like I would rather just hold on to my magic points for the life spell just in case somebody gets killed. Next up, we have Heal 2. Heal 2 is significantly more helpful than Heal 1. It's still not super strong, but it's powerful enough that its healing can out-damage certain threats. And I think I would... I think I would put that as a C, maybe a B. I feel like both Harm 3 and Heal 2 are also spells that if I had a B- or a C+, I would put those in one of those categories. Heal 2, though, I think I would do C because it is more powerful, but I still feel like in most situations, Cure 3 is just more helpful, especially because if you're casting a group heal, then the group heal is to mitigate group damage that you're receiving, most likely. And a lot of attack spells are still going to out-damage that, which kind of limits its usefulness, but it heals enough that it can get you above the threshold of kill range if you're hit by a spell and you're at risk of being hit by a follow-up spell. Now we move on to level 6 white magic. Soft. Soft I have to give an E-Ray King, because it has the same exact problem as the Pure spell, but I'm not sure exactly how economically bad Soft is, but you don't run into petrification very often in this game. So it's also not nearly as abundantly needed. But also, it has much stiffer it has similarly stiff competition to it has like the opposite problem. Level 4, you have the Pure spell, and it can be useful because the other level 4 spells suck. None of the other level 6 spells suck. So that makes Soft considerably less appealing, especially since you can just buy Soft potions instead. And also the fact that you're not going to have that spell for nearly as long, and you're also, in fact, you might get the Soft spell past the point where a number of the petrifying threats you're past them. You're not dealing with them anymore. Whereas Pure shows up right at the perfect time where you're running into a lot of poison enemies. So it's nice to have as backup, and you're also getting use out of it throughout a much larger portion of the game. So you're doing a better job of getting your money's worth out of the spell. Soft, you're never gonna get your money's worth out of the spell. Technically, you're never gonna get your money's worth out of Pure either, but you're getting a greater percentage of your money's worth out of it. Soft, it just comes too late, and it also does not get enough magic points because it's all the way up at level 6. So it's just not worth it, especially because the other level 6 white spells are just so much more useful. You've got Exit, which admittedly I never use, or at least don't use very often, but it's still an extremely useful spell to have in case of emergency. If you're struggling in a dungeon, if you're out of resources, if you just have to run away, and you have no other way out of the dungeon, Exit is a literal lifesaver. And so for that, I have to... Honestly, I think I would only rate Exit as a C. Despite the fact that I just said that it's a literal lifesaver. Just the fact that I personally never run into that situation, or I run into that situation so seldomly, that I always get the Exit spell. I almost always get the Exit spell, but never wind up using it, because I never really run into the situation where it's helpful. Sometimes I'll use it in Sometimes I'll use it in the Undersea Shrine after I visit the mermaids, or I might use it in the Sky Fortress if my inventory gets full and I want to leave to sell some stuff. But in the case of those situations, with the Sky Fortress, it's just whether or not I feel like doing that, which I usually might only do if I feel like I need a lot of money or something. And in the Undersea Shrine, it's really just if I don't feel like walking out. Sometimes I'll visit the mermaids and they just don't feel like bothering to walk out, so I'll cast the Exit spell to warp out just to save some time, make things a little easier on myself. So, but still, I think I would only put the Exit spell at C, because when it is useful, my god, it's one of the most grateful spells in the game. But I've done so many runs of this game where I buy the spell and then never use it, that I just don't think I can rate it as exceptionally high. As opposed to the other two spells, Fog 2 and Invisibility 2. These spells I would have to put at B. Maybe even A, but probably B. Part of the reason for that is they kind of get in the way of each other. They both do a very similar effect. Fog 2 increases your raw defense, while Invisibility 2 increases your evasion. And these fix the big problem with Fog and Invisibility because they affect the entire party. So if you cast Fog 2 or Invisibility 2, then no matter who the enemy attacks afterwards, you're reaping the benefits of the spell. It's not like the fog spell where you cast it on your black belt and then your black belt doesn't get smacked. You can just cast the spell and everyone is now taking reduced damage. And honestly, I would probably rank both Fog 2 and Invisibility 2 as A-rank spells. But the problem is they have such similar effects in that they both protect you from physical damage. They just protect you from physical damage in different ways. It's the question of, do you just want to increase your raw defense to just take less damage each turn? Or do you want to increase your evasion to hopefully reduce the amount of hits that the enemy is delivering to you? But the problem is, they're both competing for the same magic points. And because of that, I think I have to put them at B instead of A. Because of that. Just the magic point situation. Because every time you cast Fog 2, that's also one less magic point that you can use for Invisibility 2, and vice versa, as opposed to if they were separate levels. If they were separate levels, if one of them was a level 5 or a level 7 spell, then I would probably, and the other one stayed at level 6, then I would probably rate them both A rank. But just the fact that they're fighting each other for such similar effects, I can't do that. Moving on to level 7, we've got Cure 4. Cure 4... Cure 4, I think I gotta go back to A, because by the time you learn Cure 4, and especially by the time you're needing Cure 4, you have so many hit points that the other Cure spells have kind of fallen off, and it's just another lifesaver spell, especially if you have a Knight or a Grand Master, and you're in a boss fight, and your big, buff, beefy fighter guy is missing, like, 400 hit points. You just cast Cure 4 and they get all those hit points back, making it just so useful to have, especially because at that point in the game, so many of the enemies can deal so much damage that some of the other spells aside from Cure 3 just really aren't cutting it at this point. So I think I gotta give Cure 4 an A rank. Did I say S before? If I accidentally say S, then it means A, whatever. Then there's Harm 4. Harm 4... I think I gotta give D. Harm 4 a D, because 1 is competing with magic points for Cure 4, and the higher our levels get, the fewer magic points we have for those levels, so you're not going to have very many casts for Cure 4, or for level 7 rather, and you're probably going to be wanting to save those for Cure 4. And Harm 4 becomes even more redundant than Harm 3, especially if you got Harm 3. If you bought Harm 3 especially, then that's plenty of undead damage. Yes, Harm 4 is extremely powerful, but by the time you can get it, I feel like you're not fighting quite so many undead enemies anymore. Most of the undead enemies, I feel, are near the beginning and mid-game. And also just the fact that, again, Harm 2 is usually plenty of damage when it comes to Harm spells. So I just feel like the higher level Harm spells are handy to have, but not as much of a necessity, especially when they're competing with more powerful healing spells, which by the time you get to these higher levels, you need the more powerful healing spells a lot more than you need the more powerful Harm spells in most situations. At least I feel that way. Next is the anti-rub spell, and that... I think I'm just gonna put that at C, like the other anti-spells, because it just has all the same vices, but all the same advantages. Actually, no. I'm going to put anti-rub at D, because I feel like it's more situational than the others because of how uncommon it is to run into enemies that cast Rub, or I think Death as well. I think Death, and which is the XXXX spell, I believe that is also the same element as Rub, so I think it protects against both of those. But also, I believe by the time you start getting to the end of the game, you can start having equipment that just inherently protects you from that, and a lot of elements for that matter. So I think I would put Rub. I think Anti-Rub is another case where if I had like pluses and minuses, I would put it at either C- or D+. Because it could help you in those rare situations where you're up against an enemy that casts those kinds of spells, especially if you don't happen to have any gear that inherently protects you against death. It's just so situational that I find it hard to justify using that over just hoping for the best while saving those magic points for Cure 4 or Heal 3, which the last spell is Heal 3. And Heal 3, I think I gotta give an A rank, because that actually does heal a reliable amount of damage. It still can't outspeed a lot of attack spells, but at this point in the game, you're also starting to get armors that not only resist death, but also resist elemental damage, assuming you're using those armors. Which can be tricky if you don't know the game well enough to know what those armors are. So with Heal 3, not only does it heal a lot, but you're also starting to get spell or equipment to reduce a lot of the group damage that you're likely to be receiving. So I think Heal 3 is really good. So I think Heal 3 I would probably put at B. Not an A rank like Cure 4, I still think it's much more useful to just full heal a single character in most situations. But Heal 3 heals enough to the party that it can make a considerable difference if you're being overwhelmed. Now we move on to level 8, and this is where the ranking takes kind of a nosedive, because, as I explained in the last episode, I usually only have one level 8 magic point, meaning I'm only getting one level 8 magic point cast for the entire game, especially because I usually don't even hit that level 25 threshold until the final dungeon. So that significantly affects these rankings, because if I'm only getting one level 8 cast for the entire game, only one spell is going to be useful. That matters more for black magic than white magic, but still. So first up for level 8 we have Life 2. I'm gonna rate Life 2 a C, because by this point in the game, I probably have plenty of magic points with the life spell, which I absolutely did not skip. I would never skip learning the life spell, ever, period. Unless I just have a shit ton of red mages or white mages, and I feel like having so many life spells would be excessive. I would never skip the life spell. So by this point, I have plenty of life spells. And I also have Cure 4, or just potions, or weak cure spells to heal after casting life, assuming I even need to cast life. So Life 2, did I say C? I think I would rate Life 2 a C, because it can be extremely useful. If you could use it during battle, I would rate it an A or a B, probably A. But the fact that you can't use life in battle in this game, at least not in the original, later versions changed that, making the game too easy on top of other things they changed. But if you could cast Life 2 in battle, I think I would rate it an A, maybe a B. But yeah, there you go. But since you can't, I just feel like there's that alternative, especially because if I only get my one level 8 white spell cast, there's a lot of situations where I would just rather use life instead and then heal up through other means and call it a day, and then save my level 8 white spell for Fade. Fade gets an S rank because 9 times out of 10 it's the only level 8 white spell I will use with that one cast. It's just I think it's non-elemental damage in this game, but if you're familiar with future Final Fantasy games, it's effectively holy, except it hits all enemies. Just hits all enemies for massive damage. The description in the instruction manual is terrible. It makes it imply that it's an instant death spell on all enemies, but it's not. It's just a powerful attack on all enemies, and that's where my level 8 magic point is going to go. And then we have Wall and Exfer, which I'm never going to use with my level 8 magic point, so those both get E, because I would never use them. The Wall spell could be useful in theory, because it gives a character defenses against, I think, everything. I know it gives defenses against all the elemental damage. I don't know if it also gives defenses against status damage, like death and stuff like that. But at this point in the game, you have so much equipment that reduces damage from that stuff anyway. Not to mention that most enemies don't cast multiple elements. They only cast one element. So if I'm up against a fire enemy, I can just cast anti-fire and then I'm resistant to the only element that matters. If I'm up against an ice enemy, I can cast anti-ice. Do the same thing. And guess what? All of the previous anti-spells target your entire party, whereas the Wall spell only targets one person. So, Wall gets an E, and then Exfer gets an E because it doesn't work. One thing to keep in mind is, and I mean, even if it did work, that's actually one thing that needs to keep in mind is I'm assuming all of these spells work for my ratings. That matters more with black spells, but I'm assuming that all of the spells are fully functional. And with the patch I'm using, they are fully functional, although I don't know if it fixed Exfer. In the patch notes, Exfer wasn't mentioned, so Exfer might still be bugged. But even if it did work, all it does is remove an enemy's elemental resistances. That's not useful, especially compared to Fade or Life 2. I would rather use, in any situation, I would rather use my level 8 magic points for those. So those spells, so Exfer also gets an E. Moving on, because I'm looking at the time that's left in this video, and I've rambled for way too long about white magic. So I'm going to try to get through the black magic a little bit quicker. So black magic, level 1, first we have actually both fire and lightning. Fire and lightning I would rate a C. They're useful, but their damage is so low that they're just not all that great. They can be good early on because they can one-shot some enemies. And it does take a black mage a really long time for his basic attacks to outdamage those spells, but that can eventually happen, at least against some enemies. But the big kicker, but the big thing about that also is the sleep spell. The sleep spell gets an A rank, no doubt. It's a level 1 spell that hits all enemies. Fire and lightning only hit one enemy. It hits all enemies, it puts them to sleep, even if the enemies, and yes it can miss, but even if the enemy gets put to sleep and then instantly wakes up, that's still a turn of damage that you prevented, with a spell level that you're not going to be using for anything else once you get to a certain point. Fire and lightning are good early on, but once you get to a certain point, the damage they deal just isn't worth it anymore. And then there's the lock spell, which I think lock I would rate a D, because it can be handy, but the effect of lowering an enemy's evasion just isn't all that useful. Even, like, it can be useful very, very early on, like right at the beginning of the game, just because all of your characters have such crappy accuracy that they struggle to hit anything, and I feel like that's kind of the point of the lock spell, but that falls off even quicker than fire and lightning. And then eventually the fire and lightning spells fall off, but the sleep spell, I think, can be useful from the very start of the game all the way through to the end. And by the end of the game, you're going to have 8 or 9 sleep casts, and it's not going to be and for a vast majority of the game, it's not competing with anything. And just the fact that you can use magic points that aren't being spent for anything else to outright prevent damage, even if it's just for one turn or one attack, is just such a useful effect. that sleep has to get an A. I honestly think sleep is one of the best spells in the game because of that. Because not so much for what it does, especially because it can miss, and sometimes you might prevent it, and sometimes you might cast sleep on an enemy. The enemy attacks first, then it gets put to sleep, and then the next turn you attack it before it gets a chance for the attack on its next turn to be negated. But just the fact that it has so little competition for so much of the game, and it can be useful for so much of the game, it doesn't fall off nearly as hard as other low-level spells. That I gotta give the sleep spell that credit. Level 2 Black Magic. Level 2 Black Magic is interesting. First off is the Ice spell. I think I gotta give Ice a C rank for the same reason as Fire and Lightning. It's good. Actually, I think I would give Ice a B because its competition isn't quite as overwhelming, largely because of the sleep spell. Also, it's the only attack spell for level 2. With level 1, Fire and Lightning are kind of detrimental to each other because just like with Fog 2 and Invisibility 2, and some other spells we're going to be seeing, they're kind of very samey spells competing with each other. So I think Ice would be a B. It's a little stronger, so it has more lasting power. It doesn't have any spells that contrast with itself in a way that makes two similar spells competing with each other. And it has less stiff competition in some ways over Sleep. Ice is another one. I think I'd put it between C or B. I would like to rate it higher than Fire and Lightning, but not too much higher. Next, we have the Dark Spell. Dark Spell blinds all enemies, which can be useful, but as I discussed before, blind is kind of situational. It's not the most useful thing in the world when I was talking about the usefulness of Lamp. I think I would give Dark a C, and I'll explain that in a second. Next is the Temper Spell. The Temper Spell is one of those spells that's broken, but as I said when talking about Xfer, we're acting like all the spells function properly. And the Temper Spell, I gotta give it a B. Part of me wants to say an A or a B, because it is really useful, but I feel like it's usually only worthwhile against bosses, or just extremely powerful single enemies. That said, it is a lifesaver in those types of situations, but that does make it really situational, because you're not likely going to be using Temper to survive the dungeon or to fend off low-level enemies. So because of that, I don't think I could quite give it an A, maybe an A. Definitely a B, no lower than B, but maybe A. Slow, on the other hand, Slow, I think I would give it A ranking, and that's part of the reason why I would rank Dark a little bit lower, because it's another case of them both doing very similar things. Dark just blinds an enemy, reducing their accuracy, whereas Slow, if Slow hits an enemy, then they can only hit once. And that makes such a huge difference. The only drawback with Slow is that if you're fighting enemies that don't really hit too many times, then that minimizes its effectiveness. But it's a spell that only becomes stronger as you get further and you start fighting more and more enemies that hit several times. Because if you can just bring an enemy's hits count from 2 to 1, that's cutting his damage in half. Whereas with blinding them, yeah, you decrease their accuracy, but you can still get hit just as many times. It's just you're improving the percentages in your favor, basically. But with the Slow spell, just the fact that it's just that concrete, now they can only hit once, there you go. So Slow, I think I would give A, because it reduces damage, but the Slow spell in situations where it's useful, it reduces damage that you're receiving far more than so many other spells. And again, it competition is kind of middling. Now level 3 is kind of an interesting one because you have fire. First of all, you have fire 2 and lightning 2. Both of those have to get an A rank because they just sweep through enemies. Lightning 2 blows through water enemies. Fire 2 blows through undead, and as we already said, undead are dangerous. And just being able to do group damage, and they're such powerful spells that they can carry you through so much of the game. There's so many battles, especially when you first get those spells, that you can just wipe out an entire enemy party with those spells. So both of those I have to give an A rank just for how extremely useful they are in so many situations. Next we have the Hold spell. The Hold spell only targets one enemy and all it does is paralyze them. But I still think it has its place over Fire 2 and Lightning 2, especially if you're just against a small group of really strong enemies that those spells aren't going to one-shot anyway. It can be good to have your fighters maybe focus on one guy and take him out, and then just have your Black Mage cast Hold on the other one to save the second guy for the next round. I don't think I would give it an A rank though, because there's so many, because again, it's competing with Fire 2 and Lightning 2, which are also competing with each other, but it just depends on the elemental weaknesses of the enemy, which one will be more useful when. And in a lot of situations, if you're using one, you're probably not in a situation where you're going to be actively using the other. And because of that stiff competition with those spells, I think I have to give Hold a B. Maybe B-, but I think I would settle on B. Then lastly, for level 3 black spells, we have Lock 2. Lock 2 I have to give a D. Because why reduce the evasion of an entire group of enemies when you can just kill the group of enemies with Fire 2 or Lightning 2 instead? Especially because by the time you get Lock 2, the usefulness of reducing enemy evasion has already dropped off quite a bit. Especially because that's around the point in the game when you're probably starting to hit multiple times with your fighters, thus reducing the likelihood that you're going to have problems hitting things at all in the first place. Lock is useful because of when you get it, and at the start of the game having such a difficult time hitting things. By the time you get Lock 2, yes, it hits all enemies, but so do Fire 2 and Lightning 2, and then you have Hold to just stop an enemy that's a considerable threat. I've used Lock 2 before, but I just don't think it's that useful. I feel like the only time I would want to use Lock 2 is either just for the sake of mixing things up a little bit, or if I say have a really heavy fighter party. Like if I have 3 fighter classes and a Black Mage, then maybe I could grab Lock 2 because I'll get more out of it having 3 fighters instead of say 2 fighters and 2 mages, or 1 fighter and 3 mages or whatever, but I never do that. Fighters are boring to me. Just having characters that all they do is hit stuff, that's just not fun. A part of the fun of the game for me is strategically using my spells and deciding when and where to use my magic points to maximize efficiency in battle and my resource management. Having fighters who just completely cut out that aspect of the game just is boring to me. I just don't think fighters are fun to use, so I'm almost never going to have a fighter-heavy party. But I feel like that's what Lock 2 is meant for, is fighter-heavy parties. So I gotta give Lock 2 a D. I have used it before, but it's just nah. Moving on to level 4, which is fortunately much better than level 4 White Magic. First we have Sleep 2. Sleep 2 is a weird one. Honestly, I feel like I have to give Sleep 2 a D, maybe a D+, because it can be useful. I feel like the idea of Sleep 2 is that maybe there are certain enemies that are susceptible to sleep, but not to hold. But here's the thing, I already have the hold spell most likely because it's so unlikely that I'm going to choose Lock 2 over Hold that I probably already have the hold spell. And because it's a lower level, I have more magic points with hold than I would have with sleep 2. I still get sleep 2 sometimes though, because it can still be useful to just disable a really strong enemy for a turn. But sleep also doesn't last as long, especially because if it's an enemy that's worth being put to sleep, they're going to have so many hit points that they're going to wake up right away. Whereas paralysis, waking up from paralysis, I don't think is affected by hit points at all. Whereas with sleep, if your hit points are oh so high, then you're gonna wake up guaranteed. Whereas you then have a percentage of waking up if your hit points are below that threshold. So Sleep 2 is just not as good of a spell as Hold, and it comes at a later level. I feel like my opinions of those spells would actually differ a fair bit if those were swapped. Maybe Sleep 2 is more accurate, maybe there's more enemies susceptible to sleep. I don't know that. But I just don't think it's as that good, especially compared to the other level 4 black spells, because all 3 of the other level 4 black spells are absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, for sleep, I would give it a D, maybe a D+, because I do use it somewhat regularly. I kind of alternate between Sleep 2 and one of the other level 4 black spells. But before that, there's Fast. Fast gets an A. Fast gets an A. The fact that it doubles the amount of hits you can inflict, and the fact that that increases your damage so exponentially, and the fact that if you want to get technical, it's not glitched like the Temper spell is if you're playing the original NES game without a patch. Especially if you cast the Fast spell on something like a Black Belt. You get so much more damage by just increasing the amount of hits that you deal that Fast has to get an A. Then there's the Confuse spell. The Confuse spell is also just so powerful. I feel like I have to give Confuse a B. It hits all enemies, it confuses them. Yes, it can fail, and yes, they can wake up from the confusion. But for as long as it lasts, you're getting free damage on the enemies from them hitting each other. And that's not only free damage inflicted on the enemies to end the battle quicker, but it's also damage that you're not taking. And as I've said probably several times in this playthrough at this point, I kind of even brought it up just during this tier list. Such an important aspect of the original Final Fantasy is resource management, and being able to mitigate so much damage, even just for a single battle, can make such a big difference in getting through a dungeon and having your resources hold out until you reach the end. But that said, it's also competing with Ice 2, which is just flat out damage against enemies, which I would also rate a B, because because I would say Ice 2 is just as useful as Confuse. It just depends on the situation. If you're up against enemies that are weak against Ice, then absolutely Ice 2 is the way to go. If you're up against a group of enemies that resists Ice, or has too many enemies for Ice 2 to take out, then I feel like Confuse is the way to go, unless the enemies also resist Confusion, which that would just be on a situational basis. But if you can one-shot the enemies or set them up to immediately then be killed by your fighter with Ice 2, then I feel like Ice 2 is the better choice. But in any other situation, I feel like, again, unless the enemies just happen to resist Confusion, I feel like you're better off just confusing the enemies, so then you have more time to whittle them down without getting pounded in the meantime. Alright, let's see, we're getting to the home stretch. I'm rushing a bit more with the black magic because we are running out of time. I spent way too long talking about white magic, but also I genuinely don't think there's as much to say about black magic. I feel like it's much more I feel like the black spells are much more cut and dry, especially because it's just a question of dealing damage or dealing status effects. It's so much more it's so much more the same decision over and over again. With white magic, I feel like it's tougher decisions because you're having to decide between damage or heal or status. I just feel like there's a lot more to consider with each white level than with each black level, because white spells overall I just think are more diverse with what they do and the benefits they provide, and the question of would you rather be able to heal or would you rather be able to do damage, or would you rather be able to heal or would you rather just be able to reduce damage so that you won't need to heal, or would you like to do both? I don't know, I genuinely feel like the white magic choices are a lot more complex than the black magic choices, with the exception of level 4, because as we discussed, level 4 white magic sucks. And from what I've seen online, that's a consensus. Everybody agrees with that. Those spells just are not good. So moving on to level 5 black magic. First of all, we have Fire 3. That's an A rank spell just because it's just an extremely powerful spell that hits all the enemies. Bane, I think. I think I have to give that a C. I'm thinking B, but I think I have to give it a C because of the competition with Fire 3. Yes, Bane can instantly kill enemies, and if you're up against enemies that resist fire, then Bane is going to be the ideal choice, and if it works, it instantly kills them, so it's still a really good spell. But competing with Fire 3, I just feel like it's less... I feel like Bane has less going for it over Fire 3 than Confuse has going for it over Ice 2. Because Fire 3 is just a stronger spell, and you're also going to have fewer magic points with level 5. Next is Warp. Warp is a weird spell. If you could get Warp earlier, I would rate it higher. But I feel like Warp comes after it's useful. The main dungeons I would want to use Warp are Gurgu Volcano and the Ice Cavern. But you can't get Warp until after the Ice Cavern because you need to get the floater so you can get the airship, so you can meet Bahamut, get promoted, because the Black Mage and the Red Mage can't cast Warp. You have to get promoted to learn Warp. And Gurgu Volcano or Mount Golg or whatever you want to call it, that conventionally comes before the Ice Cavern. And those are the main 2 dungeons where I feel like Warp would be useful. Warp still can be useful. I think I would give Warp a D, though. Just because of the fact that there's just so few situations where it's useful. I do sometimes learn it, but I basically never use it. It's just being able to go back one floor. It can be handy to save time or to avoid battles, but by the time I've learned it, I'm at that point in the game where resource management is so much less significant because you start getting all the really powerful stuff like the Wizard Staff and the Mage Staff and the Zeus Gauntlet and the Heal Staff. So you're at the point now, or just about at the point now, where resource management matters so little, survivability matters so little because you're basically invincible, that I would rather just fight the battles and get the experience by walking from place to place rather than taking little shortcuts here and there whenever possible with the Warp spell, which would be useful in the dungeons before that point, which are Mount Golg and the Ice Cavern. And the Earth Cave to a slightly lesser extent. Mostly for that, it would be for making it a little bit easier to get back out. But at that point, you're not going to really have enough magic points to make very good use of that anyway for level 5. Last level 5 spell is Slow 2, and I rated Slow an A, I think, maybe B, an A, I think. I'm not writing any of this down. And some of these are so up in the air. I'm literally just coming up with these rankings off the top of my head. You ask me to rate these things tomorrow, and I might give different ratings for them. Some spells I would still say the same thing, but I might give different ratings for some of the spells, especially ones that I'm a little on the fence about. But last is Slow 2. Slow 2 I think I would rate a C. I think I would rate it a D if it has stiffer competition, but just the presence of Warp not being all that exciting, I think I'd give Slow 2 a C, because it's just a worse version of the Slow spell that comes at a higher level. Yes, it's more accurate, but it also only targets one enemy. And there are so few situations where I would want to cast Slow on a single enemy, as opposed to just trying to take out that enemy, or trying to hit that enemy with something like Hold or Sleep 2. That it's not that useful. The main thing that makes Slow useful is reducing the damage you're taking, especially if you're against a large group of enemies that hit 4 or 5 times. You hit all of them with Slow, and you're now going to take hundreds of less damage in this battle. Whereas with Slow 2, the difference that you're going to see in the damage you take is so much less significant that it just is kind of underwhelming. Okay, we're at the final boss, so I really gotta do like crunch time with this now. So, level 6, Black Spells. Lightning 3, I would rate an A for the same reasons as Fire 3. Rub I would rate an E, because it's competing with Quake at the same level. Both Rub and Quake are instant death spells. Rub hits one enemy, Quake hits the entire enemy party. Why would I want to cast a instant death spell that hits only one enemy when I can cast a spell that does the exact same thing on the entire enemy party? Yes, they do different elements. Rub, I believe, is Death Elemental, whereas Quake is Earth Elemental. Different enemies have different susceptibilities to different elements. Some enemies are susceptible to Bane because they're weak to poison. Some are susceptible to Rub because they're weak to death. Some are susceptible to Quake because they're weak to Earth. I don't know the game that well, though. And I'm not going to sit there experimenting on every single enemy casting Rub, trying to insta-kill them. If there's a single enemy I want dead, I'm going at them with my fighters and casting something like Hold or Sleep 2 to hold them off, to hold the enemy off in the meantime. Or just casting something like Temper on my fighter to get rid of the enemy quicker. I'm not going to be using Rub. If I'm using Quake, it's because there's a large group of enemies that I don't think I will be able to one-shot with Lightning 3. So I'm just going for the insta-kill with Quake. So Rub gets an E just because it's competing with the Quake spell. Whereas with Quake I would rate a B. Or maybe a C. Yeah, I rated Bane a C, so I think I'm gonna rate Quake a C as well. No, yeah, wait. Yeah, Quake would be a C because of the other competition that is competing with. Quake would be a C. It's really reliable. I've had a lot of luck with the Quake spell, with killing stuff. But the fact that it's competing with Lightning 3 means I'm only really going to be using it against a group of enemies who I don't think I will be able to one-shot with Lightning 3 or damage enough with Lightning 3 that I can then finish them with supplemental damage from other characters on top of the Lightning 3 damage, making it a very useful spell in those situations, but a very situational spell because of that. Lastly is the Stun spell. The Stun spell... What did I rate Hold? I think I rated Hold a B. I think I would rate Stun a B as well. The thing with Stun is it will automatically paralyze an enemy. It has, I think, a guaranteed hit rate, but it only affects enemies that have 300 or lower hit points. I believe you can weaken an enemy to bring them down a bit, and if an enemy's that low, that late in the game, there's a good chance you can just take them out quickly enough. But it's still really useful to have against some strong enemies. And just the fact that it has that guaranteed success if their hit points are low enough gives it an edge over hold, because hold can miss. And I do find myself using stun a lot, especially against certain enemies, certain endgame enemies that are maybe tough to take out because they have a lot of defense, but maybe they don't have too many hit points. So I just stun them so I can then focus on everything else, and then blah blah blah. Stun, B, maybe C, somewhere in there. Alright, we're right at the ending. So rapid fire, level 7, Ice 3 would get an A rank for the same reason as the other level, for the other 3 spells. Break would get a D. Break would get a D because don't have very many magic points for level 7. It's competing with Ice 3, which is just massive damage on everything. It's just another instant death spell that only hits one enemy. So if I'm going for instant death, I'm probably just going to cast Quake or Bane instead. So I just don't see myself really using Break. Saber gets an E because it's a spell that increases physical attack potency, but you can only use it on yourself, and the red wizard can't use it. So Saber sucks. Saber gets an E because it's a physical attack buff that only the black mage can cast only on himself, but even after casting that, the black mage's attack strength is still going to be so pitiful that it wasn't worth casting. So Saber gets an E. It can be useful with the power gauntlet, so because of that armor, the existence of it is good. But aside from that, it's just sucky. Blind gets an E because it blinds an enemy, but unlike Dark, it only hits one enemy. I think it has the same accuracy guarantee thing as Stun, but that late in the game, I'm not going to be blinding enemies. So that gets an E. Level 8, same problem as the white magic, except even more so. I'm only getting one level 8 black spell on most runs. So Nuke gets an A because that's the black spell I'm going to be using at level 8. Stop, Zap, XXXX, all of those get E because I'm never going to use them because I'm only getting 1, maybe 2 casts. The footage of the game just ended. I'm only getting 1, maybe 2 casts of level 8 black magic for the entire game, and I'm not going to use those on either a spell that paralyzes all enemies, a spell that insta-kills all enemies, or a spell that insta-kills one enemy, since all of those can fail, instead of just blasting all of the enemies with a spell that is probably strong enough to take them all out, especially because I usually save the nuke spell for the final boss anyway, and I would rather have that high damage spell for the final boss than anything that I could get out of those other spells throughout the final dungeon. Especially because the final dungeon really isn't very difficult because of all of the magic armors and such you have at that point. So there you go. And that is my, basically off the top of my head, sort of impromptu tier list of the Final Fantasy I spells. Again, purely my opinions, purely based on how I play the game and my experiences with it. And not in a thoroughly analytic or thought out list. And with that, we have completed Final Fantasy I. And since the footage has ended, there's nothing else to see, so I will see you next time.